I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network, chatting with writers and authors who offer an added perspective for our listeners. This is Color Between the Lines. On this edition of Color Between the Lines, we're talking with civil rights activist and the youngest person to be president of the NAACP between 2008 and 2013. His name is Ben Jealous, who is currently a professor of the practice at the University of Pennsylvania and the executive director of the Sierra Club. And he's here to talk to me about his book he penned called Never Forget Our People Were Always Free, A Parable of American Healing. Here, he provides some insights about race relations in America while looking through the lens of his own family's history. Thank you, Ben Jealous, for joining us on the BIN.
Thank you. It's always good to be on the Black Information Network.
Well, first, congratulations on the book. It is a fun read, a lot of great stories, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. I want you to explain first, in this book, you pay tribute to your grandmother, Mamie Todd Bland. Please tell our listeners a little bit more about how she influenced this title, Never Forget Our People Were Always Free, and what did you come to realize she meant by saying this, as you share, she used to share with you when you were younger?
Yeah, my grandmother, when I started writing this book, was dying chronologically. Esther, she was 103, and we knew she wouldn't live forever. Mm-hmm. And she used to say again and again, never forget our people were always free. She said it so much. My sister would go to dinners when she was in college to assert that. It was kind of like all we knew about her people, except for the fact we also knew that 3 of her grandparents were born into slavery, and by talking to her sister eventually, and that the 4th was an alleged rapist. So it was like, by the time I was a teenager, I was like, Grandma, what are you talking about? And with the help of historians, DNA experts on multiple continents for that matter, I finally figured out, and some anthropologists and some psychologists, what was going on with my grandmother, where that phrase came from. We dug and it turns out that the female Kunta Kinte in our family, if you will, the first woman to show up in that maternal line from Africa, descended from the Polynesian founders of Madagascar. She was an Afro-Polynesian pirate, brought over on a slave ship piloted by a pirate. The result, not of a traditional slave trade, but rather of a decades-long war between if not centuries, between Madagascar pirates and European pirates. And when a pirate community would lose in Madagascar, the Europeans occasionally, because there are only ever 17 slave ships to arrive in America this way, would seek to enslave the able-bodied people of the village and deliver them to Virginia or New York. Those are the 2 places where they were brought. Well, what else would a pirate woman say to her children, her grandchildren born into slavery, but never forget our people were always free? And how would she say it?
Yeah.
She would say it in a way to inspire resistance, if not insurrection, to help children understand that was their people's destiny, because it had been their people's history. And that, of course, is a very dangerous act in the context of slavery, a very rebellious act. And the interesting thing about the women who repeated this is that, by the time that they came into sort of my world, where I knew kind of the stories from my mom and my grandmother about my grandmother's mom, my grandmother's grandmother, my grandmother's great-grandmother even, none of those women remembered where the family came from. None of those women could have possibly recalled when this actually made sense, but all of them said it. And looking at some other case studies about sayings passed down around patrilineal lines and matrilineal lines, they can go back centuries and centuries. In this case, it only seemed to go back a couple of centuries. My grandmother was born in 1916. So just a couple of centuries back, perhaps to the early 1700s, when the Madagascar slave trade was kind of at its most common. But what was important, if you will, even more than where it came from, even more than when it actually figuring out what it made sense, was the spirit inspired in these women, the way that it put steel in their spine, the way that it encouraged my grandmother's grandmother to run away from slavery, the way they encouraged my grandmother's daughter, my mom, to sue her high school when she was 12 so she could be in the first class to desegregate it when she was 15. And that's, that was the search of the book, if you will. A lot more in the book, but that was the search of the book.
Wow. Well, you explained in the book that you're from a long line of biracial descendants and that some of your relatives included Dick Cheney, which I was very surprised at, Robert E. Lee, and President Thomas Jefferson. How did this knowledge affect you when you first learned about this?
Yeah, well, there was all in pieces. Those are all cousins. And I used to joke when I was young, because we're so light-skinned, that we were black in the Jeffersonian model of blackness until I figured out he was a cousin. At which point my son, who was then probably 8 at the time, said, well, I'm just going to call him Cousin TJ because that man's so problematic. Robert E. Lee, figuring out Robert E. Lee was our cousin, that shook me to my core. Cheney, I was maybe prepared for because Obama's mom is also an Obama, our cousin Cheney. Yeah. But the thing people forget about blackness is it was defined by one drop of African blood. Mm-hmm. So, firstly, all black people in the United States who descend from slaves are African and European, kind of a Creole mix, if you will. You can be darker, you can be lighter, but you go into your DNA and it's all right there. Mm-hmm. What
do you think it ultimately had a hand in your activist career?
Oh, absolutely, and that of my ancestors in ways that actually may not be linear. Like, I always say this, there's no doubt that both my grandparents, you can actually find abolitionists who appeared to have been activists even as slaves, who were defiant as slaves, who organized other slaves, and then went on to do that on my grandfather's side of the family, in the 2 decades leading into the Civil War, coming out. Some of them even earlier than that. On my grandmother's family, though, what was interesting about them is they were slaves right to the last day in Virginia, right to the end of the Battle of Appomattox, and then they walked out and took over the place. And that always fascinated me. How could he be a slave to the last day, be 17 years old like her grandfather was, then Edward David Bland, and half a lifetime later, 35, be the head of a political party in the state? And that he became the head of the Black Republicans, who at that point, is after the end of Reconstruction, they were kind of the last Republicans left. The carpetbaggers had mostly returned north. And where does that hubris come from? Well, part of it had to come from the fact that he would have known, because of other facts explored in the book, that he was Robert E. Lee's cousin. Mm. And so part of the intimacy of slavery, in that Jeffersonian tradition where people understood, that they shared bloodlines with the people who owned them, had to come a certain type of hubris to say, well, if we got the same blood, and if y'all run the state or y'all even run the country like Thomas Jefferson, then why can't we do it too?
Hmm. You mentioned 3 big lies about race that people didn't realize. Can you explain a little bit about what these 3 lies are?
Yeah, the 3 big lies about racism in our society are A, it's always been this way, so it's always going to be this way. B, only white folks, call it the Archie Bunker myth, paid a price for desegregation. And, finally, that racism only hurts Black folks. And taking those one by one, it actually hasn't always been this way. This modern notion of race upon which barbaric tradition of racism in America is based comes into existence 100 years after slaves first showed up in Virginia. It's not an early 1600s invention. It's an early 1700s invention. Why is that significant? Because before there were slave rebellions, there were colonial rebellions. Before people were so divided by color, they came together across lines of color to fight for their future, to fight for their children's future. The earliest rebellions in America are European indentured servants and African slaves rising up together. And even after the creation of race, right up to the eve of the Revolutionary War, the tradition continued. What's his name? Paul Revere famously painted the Boston Massacre as all white. Mm-hmm. But John Adams, ironic enough, was a defense lawyer for the British troops that mowed down those Americans that day. Before he became president, he was the defense lawyer for the British troops who murdered the young Americans in the Boston Massacre. And when he defended those officers, he explained that their actions were justified in part by describing the crowd as Negroes, mulattoes, and jack tars. Mm. The Boston Massacre, in other words, wasn't just Crispus Attucks that we talked about. There was several black folks there that day and several white folks. Jack tars referred to the poorest whites in the U.S. Navy. Mm-hmm. And in fact, my grandmother's grandfather, an epic of history we don't talk about, I think because honestly, during Jim Crow, which followed right after this period, knowledge of it was so dangerous that they ripped it out of every history book. Mm. But in the early 1880s, in multiple states, a third party was created to preserve the free public schools started during Reconstruction by the black-led government, who are now being systematically pushed out of office in the early 1880s, but there's still a critical mass. And my grandmother's grandfather in Virginia helped build that party. His partner was a former Confederate general. And together they created a party. They took a party that first was white men trying to defend the public schools, who were quickly joined by black men trying to defend the free public schools. The black men led in by my grandmother's grandfather. The general was William B. Mahone, my grandmother's grandfather, a delegate named Edward David Bland. And they built a party who was majority black. The principal leader was a former Confederate general, and the deputy, if you will, was a freedman, Edward David Bland. I mean, when did it ever teach you that the former Confederate soldiers, these are the men who defended slavery but never owned slaves. The former Confederate soldiers, the poor white folks who fought in the Civil War, and the freemen ever got together and did anything constructive, let alone create political parties, let alone take over state governments, preserve the free public schools, radically expand public universities like Virginia Tech, create the first public HBCUs like Virginia State, abolish the poll tax, if only for a few years until they were driven out by the Klan, people assassinated in the re-election effort. But, and you have to ask yourself, why is this history so hidden? It's so easy to find. Even in our own kind of experience, if you will, Martin Luther King was assassinated not in the desegregation battle. He was assassinated organizing the Poor People's Campaign. Mm-hmm. He was trying to bring together poor whites and poor blacks into an army to end poverty. That's what they killed him.
For those of you who are just joining us, I'm talking to Ben Jealous, author of a great book entitled Never Forget Our People, We're Always Free, A Parable of American Healing. I wanted to ask, when I was reading chapter 6, 2 words came to mind, fearless and death wish. I admire your spirit of activism, but you really stood against the odds with organizing protests in Mississippi to help HBCUs. I love the whole crazy story about you and Dave Chappelle. Without giving the whole story away, I would love you to just kind of explain to our listeners what you and Dave were doing down in Mississippi and why was it so dangerous?
It was me, Dave, and Stacey Abrams. Stacey and I were 19 years old. Stacey's native to Mississippi and moved to Georgia for high school, the parents. And she was at Spelman. And the schools, like those that many of her family in Mississippi had gone to, the governor was trying to shut down public HBCUs in Mississippi. Mississippi Valley State, Alcorn State, Jackson State. And Dave was down there. The tickets were $3. $3. $5 for general admission, $3 for students. Oh. To help us raise money, because we were organizing what would be the largest student protest in the history of Mississippi since, I think, maybe 1972. The same day, or same week that the students were killed at Kent State in Ohio, the national protest in the Vietnam War, the National Guard killed students at Jackson State protesting the Vietnam War. And so there had been a real suppression of student activism at Jackson State ever since. But when the school itself was threatened, when its peer schools, one of them was going to be turned into a prison, Mississippi Valley State, it's time to wake up the students and get them out into the streets. And Dave came down to help us raise money.
Wow. It was just a fantastic part of the book. I enjoyed it. And I was like, wow, this is so cool listening to just reading it. And I could, kind of try to imagine what it was like back then. And it must have been.
Well, he saved my life that day. It's a beauty. Dave and I are inheritors of our father's love for each other, our father's friendships. His father was staying at my parents' wedding. His father was my godfather. It's the greatest gift that our dads ever gave us. We've been pretty much attached at the hip since we were 18 years old. We both have very kind of intense lives in different spheres, but we make time, 6 or more times a year to get together. Our families always have Thanksgiving. It's one of the great joys of my life.
Other thing that I noticed about the book, and I imagine part of the reason why you became an activist and organizer in college was because of your mother and father's interracial marriage. Can you perhaps explain to our listeners how they met, and what are some of the lessons that you learned from them that inspired you to become the person you are today?
My parents are courageous romantic. My mom was dating a black race car driver. My dad, she was dating a woman who would never date a man after him. She would go on and come out of the closet, I guess. And they each were very intense relationships with their own partners. But they were in a program training teachers, and they shared the same classroom. In the context of stewarding the same classroom, black kids growing up in the poorest district in Baltimore, Harlem Park, it's where our family church is. It's where my parents taught middle school. It was home to the largest free black community before the Civil War. Great history, but it's been mired in a lot of poverty ever since. They fell in love. And my dad asked my mom out on a date, and she first demurred, and then she said yes. They were both away from their boyfriends and their girlfriend at the time, geographically. And my dad, in 2 weeks, asked my mom to marry him 3 times.
Wow.
The first time she was like, slow down. I never plan to date a white guy. I'm not no. But the second time she said no, she went to her aunt. If you asked me one more time, I might just say yes. I don't know if the aunt got to my dad or what, but he somehow got the courage to ask my mom a 3rd time in 2 weeks. She said yes. They broke up with their girlfriend, their boyfriend. They were married 2 months later. It was against the law in Maryland. Wow. So they were not allowed to return legally. Other couples were, at that point flouting the law. There was hope that the anti-miscegenation laws, they were called, that banned interracial marriage would be ended soon. But they were still very active. And the case that would end them, of course, was Loving versus Virginia, which was rising in the court system at that time. Dad essentially looked at mom and just said, look, we already got Loving versus Virginia in the courts. We don't need Jealous versus Maryland, too.
Yeah.
And they headed out ultimately to California.
Wow. I guess my last question would be, what is the overarching message that you hope the readers will come away with after reading this great book?
The message of the book is the message that Dr. King was trying to teach all of us when he died, which is that racism is many things. Ultimately, it is a wedge designed to divide the poor in order to preserve the power of a few of the richest people to remain insanely wealthy. As terrible as racism has been for us as black folks, you have to ask yourself what made it so valuable to a king back in the early 1700s. What made it valuable to the king was that the military had failed to stop the rebellions of European indentured servants and African enslaved people. And new laws in the colonies had failed. And this new pseudoscientific falsehood, this theory that there were multiple human races and that Negroes were subhuman, was the most effective thing they had ever created to split the two groups, and yet that has never completely worked. Right up through Dr. King, right up to the people we saw in the streets of Minneapolis after George Floyd, working class white folks, working class black folks, working class people of color, working class white folks, keep coming back together in the interest of all of our children. And that's the real call of this book, is to come together, make this country what it needs to be for all our kids, so we can finally move forward faster.
Well, that was a great ending to this interview. Thank you, Ben Jealous, for sharing with us today.
Thank you. I really appreciate the time.
You've been listening to an interview with Ben Jealous, professor of the practice at the University of Pennsylvania and the executive director of the Sierra Club. He's a scholar, a journalist, civil rights leader, and now the author of a book entitled Never Forget Our People Were Always Free, A Parable of American Healing. I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network.